Okay, hi everyone, and welcome back to the Vision in Language seminar series. Today we have with us Dr. Abhishek Das, who is a research scientist at Facebook AI. He got his PhD from Georgia Tech, advised by Dhruv Batra and working closely with Devi Parikh, and his bachelor's degree from the Indian Institute of Technology at Roorkee. So during his PhD, Abhishek has contributed significantly to vision and language, especially through his work on visual dialogue and embodied question answering. His research focus is on deep learning and its applications to climate change. And today he will talk about building agents that can see, think, and act. See, think, talk, and act. So he has published in many top tier machine learning, vision, and NLP conferences, and has also been the top reviewer at CVPR and NeurIPS. So I would like to point out another of his significant, deeply significant contributions to the AI community, which is the AI Deadlines webpage, which maintains countdown timers for all of us to track and chase and challenge ourselves with. So without further delay, I think it's time for us to get to see Abhishek talk about how he thinks and acts upon his research ideas. So over to you, Abhishek.
Thanks, Tejas, for the introduction. Yeah, the feedback on AI deadlines is always interesting. It's quite polar. Some people like it. Some people find it extremely stress-inducing. So I never know whether to take it down or leave it up. So good to hear that you find it useful. Okay, so I'm Abhishek. I'm a research scientist at Facebook AI Research. Like they just said, before that, I was a PhD student at Georgia Tech. Today, I'm going to be talking about building agents that can see, talk, and act. So let's start by zooming out a bit and see where things are in terms of the current sort of state of the art in AI. And I'm going to be looking at vision, language, and reinforcement learning. So in computer vision, we now have models that do a pretty good job of detecting people in images, detecting various objects, describing images with natural language sentences, even answering questions about images to a reasonable extent. If we look at progress in language, we have pretty good translation tools. We also have some tools in production that combine vision and optical character recognition to translate and superimpose translations onto visual input in real time. And there's also Gmail Smart Reply that uses deep learning under the hood that works quite well. So a lot of these technologies are making it into production. And we also, a lot of us also interact on a regular basis with a whole bunch of these assistive agents that work quite well. If you look at reinforcement learning, a lot of the significant advances have been in games. So games such as StarCraft or Doom or AlphaGo from institutes like OpenAI and DeepMind. We are yet to see sort of more real world applications of reinforcement learning, but a lot of these advances are quite exciting. So this is great. And a lot of the current state of the art in AI is fueled by these data sets and simulators, infrastructure and compute in terms of just more GPUs or frameworks like PyTorch and TensorFlow, and deeper and bigger compute intensive models, right? It's sort of a combination of these that has led to some of the recent advances. But if you now think of what's missing, we can consider this example. So here's an image. A machine learning model might describe it with a caption like several people in suits. Oops, sorry. But there's actually so much more happening in this image, right? There are some mirrors. So some people are actually replicas. Not all of them are actual unique humans, right? There's a person who's standing on a weighing scale. So an intelligent agent should have some understanding of how weighing scales work. There's another person with their foot on it. And we sort of understand the psychology and the common sense that higher measures on a weighing scale are typically not looked down upon, and people are conscious about their weight. And so the surrounding people are laughing in anticipation. And so there's so much more to understanding this sort of an image than just simple concepts. There's some elements of physics, psychology, common sense, and so on, right? And these are very hard to learn from static image or text corpuses from the internet. And so basically what we need is that we need a different way to make all of this information available to algorithms. And my sort of thesis is that embodiment is the way to go for that. That we need these algorithms to be situated in real world environments to be able to learn all of these things. And if you think of an application of that, we can imagine a scenario such as this, where there's a physical agent that's capable of perceiving the visual world and taking actions in the environment that it's situated in. And at the same time, it's capable of talking to humans in natural language. So a human might ask, is there smoke in any room around you? The robot might respond, yes, in one room. And we might instruct it to go there and look for people and so on, right? And this is essentially what I mean by agents that can see, talk, and act. And so my goal, my research agenda is to develop new tasks, move from static datasets to interactive environments, and build algorithms that make progress towards this goal of having agents that can see, talk, and act. So this is going to be the outline of today's talk. I'm going to start by talking about visual dialogue, then we move to embodied question answering. Then I want to plug in a little bit about my recent work on the Open Catalyst project. This is not going to be, that's not going to be related to vision and language, but hopefully will still be useful. And then I'll discuss some future work. So let's start with visual dialogue. The goal here is to build agents that can see and talk. So what I mean by that is that given an image like this, a machine might generate a description. A man and a woman are holding umbrellas. A human might ask a follow-up question, what color is his umbrella? To answer this, the model has to understand which person the word his refers to, focus on the umbrella held by that person, and then respond back in natural language, his umbrella is black. As a follow-up question, the human might ask, what about hers? Note that this is a more complicated reference. The model has to first understand which person the word her refers to, then figure out from the dialogue history that hers is actually referring to the object held by that person, which is the umbrella, and then respond back with the answer, hers is multicolored. A human might ask another question, how many other people are in the image? This is even more complicated. The model needs to keep track of all the people that have been talked about in the dialogue history so far, and then subtract them from the total number of people in the image, and then respond back with something like, I think 3, and they are included. So concretely, the task in visual dialogue is that given an image, a dialogue history consisting of a sequence of question-answer pairs, and a follow-up question, the model has to predict a free-form natural language answer. So to start studying this problem, we began by collecting a large-scale data set. So we had this 2-person interface on Amazon Mechanical Turk, where on the left, I'm showing the questioner, and on the right, I'm showing the answerer. The questioner cannot see the image. The answerer can see the image. And the task is for the questioner to ask questions to be able to figure out what's in the image. So for example, here, the questioner asks, is the man wearing a helmet? To which they get a response, no, he does not have a helmet on. Then there's a follow-up question, how old is the man? To which they get an answer back, he looks around 40 years old, and so on. Right? So in total, we collected data on 130,000 images from COCO, which contains, on each image, we have a 10-round question-answer dialogue, which amounts to a total of 1.3 million dialogue question-answer pairs. So it's a fairly large data set. This data set is publicly available for people to download and train models on. And if we look at how we evaluate models on this task, we provide models 100 answer options. These answer options consist of course, the true answer from the data set, as well as answers to nearest neighbor questions, popular answers, and randomly selected answers. So for this example on the right here, for the question, is the other one holding anything? The answer list might look something like this. And then the model is ranked on standard retrieval metrics as to where it ranks the true answer in within that sort of candidate list of answers, right? We've been hosting a challenge on this data set for a while now. We've gotten more than 2,000 submissions on our evaluation server. And if you look at how performance has improved over the years, on NDCG, which is one of the standard metrics for this task, performance has increased by more than 23 absolute points over our initial work. So this is quite significant. If you look at the winners from just a couple of years back, there's still a 17-point difference. So a lot of that initial boost that you see is coming from transformer-based architectures in the past year or so, which makes sense. But if we now look back at some of the failures that these sort of models still continue to make, we find examples like this. So here, for the question, what color is the cat? So all of the questions here are from the dataset, and the answers are being predicted by the model. So for the question, what color is the cat? The model predicts orange and white. Is the cat on the floor? The answer is yes. What is the cat on? The model predicts I can't tell. So as you can see, there's some amount of inconsistency here. Earlier, the model predicts that the cat's on the floor, but then if it's asked the same thing in a different paraphrasing, it gets the answer wrong. Moving forward, there's another sort of amusing tidbit here. For the question, can you see anything in the mirror? The model predicts no, just the cat and the cat, which is interesting and might be because the model sees the face of the head of the cat twice in this image. Here's another failure case. Again, there are several dialog rounds for which the model predicts I can't tell. And so if you think of why the model might be making these errors, it comes back to how we train these models. So the model is basically artificially injected at every dialog round, and it never gets to steer the conversation more than one round of dialogue. So it actually, during the course of training, never gets to see the errors that it's making. And so there's a vast space of relevant responses that it never gets to explore. To start sort of addressing some of these issues, in our follow-up work, we introduced a different way of training some of these models. So we had this two-agent game, which is similar to how we collected the data in the first place, but basically the idea was that there's a QBot and ABot. The QBot asks questions and is blindfolded, so it cannot see the image. The ABot answers questions and has access to the image. And the task is basically for QBot and ABot to talk to each other for a fixed number of rounds, at the end of which QBot makes a prediction of what it thinks the secret image was, right? More concretely, there are two agents. The environment is the image. The action space for QBot is the question that it asks. The action space for ABot is the answer that it predicts. And QBot additionally makes a prediction of the image featured so at the end of the conversation. So it's trying to guess what the secret image was. As you might imagine, apologies for the alignment here, but the state of QBot consists of the entire dialogue history, and the state for ABot consists of the entire dialogue history as well as the image. So ABot has access to the image and QBot does not. Here's an overview of what the architecture looks like. So on the left in green, I'm showing the policy for QBot, the site that asks questions. So conditioned on the dialogue state, QBot predicts a question. ABot on the right takes that question as input, conditioned on that question and previous dialogue state and the image, it predicts the answer to that question. QBot processes that as input and then has a fully connected layer that makes a prediction of the image feature. And the reward function here is essentially just trying to measure whether QBot's prediction is improving, QBot's prediction of the image feature is improving or not. So if you look at the equation here, it's essentially just trying to measure that in subsequent rounds of dialogue, the distance between the ground truth image and the predicted image, is it decreasing or not? If it's decreasing, then it gets positive reward. If it's not decreasing, then it gets negative reward. And we train both of these policies jointly with reinforcement learning using the reward function I just described. And once these models are trained, if we look at some of the results that we get, so on the left here, I'm showing QBot, ABot dialogue that's sampled from supervised learned agents. And on the right here, I'm showing dialogue that's sampled from reinforcement learned agents. There's quite a bit of difference. So on the left, if you skim down to the end of the dialogue, there's actually several repeated instances. So the QBot repeatedly asks what color are his shoes and gets the answer black. Whereas on the right, there's significantly less repetition and the questions and answers are actually quite diverse. At least it seems like QBot and ABOT are exploring a larger space of questions and answers, which is nice. Here's another example. Again, on the left, there's quite a bit of repetition in what QBot and ABOT talk about. On the right, there's a much more diversity. And since then, we've sort of had a few more follow-up works that have looked at how to improve this sort of a setup and how we train these models even further. So we had a paper at EMLP last year led by Vishwak, where we looked at an additional auxiliary loss that maximizes the distance between subsequent questions that get asked. So that sort of encourages QBot to ask even more diverse questions in the hope that that might make it obtain more information about what the secret image was. And another sort of follow-up work that we've done more recently is now it's probably obvious, but like we've tried transformer baselines for the task of visual dialogue, and that has led to significant improvements. And both of these works were led by Vishwak, who used to be a master's student at Georgia Tech, but now a PhD student at Princeton. Moving forward to embodied question answering. So far, what we've looked at is how can we build agents that can process images and answer questions in sort of a conversational form about images. But if we go back to this example, there's actually so much more happening, right? Like there's a physical agent that's situated in this sort of an environment. And so if you think of what are the challenges in moving from a static corpus of images to this sort of a physical agent, there's actually a lot going on here. When you move to this sort of a situated environment, you lose access to well-composed curated images. You have to deal with first-person egocentric vision. In fact, there's no fixed data set of this first-person vision, right? The agent is taking actions, and that sort of controls what the incoming data distribution looks like. So it's actively controlling the pixels that it sees in future. And we lose dense supervision. We no longer have supervision for each step as to what the agent should predict. There might actually be a sequence of hundreds or thousands of actions that the agent takes, at the end of which it gets a single scalar reward, whether it was successful or not. And we want to be able to address all of this while being able to talk to the agent in natural language. And so to start studying a problem that combines all of these challenges and moves towards a more realistic setup, we recently introduced the task of embodied question answering. So in embodied question answering, the task is that there's an agent that's situated in an environment, and it's asked a question, for example, what color is the car? The agent has to understand the question, navigate the environment to find the object that the question asks about, and then respond back with the answer. And this sort of combines all of the challenges that I talked about. There's first-person egocentric vision, there's action execution in an environment, and there's language understanding. So to start studying this problem, we began again by introducing a data set of questions in environments. So for environments, we used House 3D, which is work out of Facebook AI research. It's an interactive environment built on the SunCG dataset. House 3D is nice in that at every point in an environment, it provides access to RGB, semantic segmentation, depth, and top-down maps. And we use all of this to train our agents. But we train our agents in a way such that at test time, it only needs RGB images. So it doesn't use any of this privileged information at test time. In total, we had 800 environments from House 3D, consisting of 12 room types and 50 object types. And we made sure that there's no overlap between train, val, and test environments. So we strictly check for generalization to novel environments. Moving to questions, our questions were programmatically generated in a manner similar to Clever, for those of you familiar with that work. Basically, the idea was that we have a few primitive functions, such as select, singleton, query, and relate. And given all of the information, all of the annotations that we have for a particular 3D scene, we can execute these primitives. So for example, select objects extracts all of the objects in that environment, passing that list of objects into the singleton function will filter that list to retain objects that occur only once. And then we can query the location for all of the objects in that environment to generate a whole bunch of questions, like what room is the piano located in, what room is the rug located in, what room is the cutting board located in, and so on. And these primitives can actually be combined in different ways to generate different kinds of questions. So for example, here, if we combine these primitives in a different sequence, we get questions of the form, what color is the PlayStation in the living room, what color is the toy in the gym, and so on. So in total for this initial work, we had 3 kinds of questions: location, color, and place preposition. So location questions are of the form, what room is the blah located in? Color questions are of the form, what color is the cup in the living room? And place preposition questions are of the form, what is above let's say the piano in the dining room, and so on. Moving on to the models. So again, as a reminder, the task definition is that given a question such as what color is the sofa in the living room, the model has to understand the question, navigate to the object that the question asks about, and then respond back with the answer. So it's spawned at a random location in the environment, and in the red box, I'm showing where the sofa is. Our model was composed of 2 parts. There was a master policy and a sub policy. The master policy's job was that given a first-person observation, it will predict what the next sort of sub-goal should be. So here it predicts that it needs to exit the current room. That sub-goal gets executed by the corresponding exit room sub-policy. Once that's done, control gets handed back to the master policy that takes as input the next first-person observation and predicts what the next sub-goal should be. So it predicts find the living room. That gets executed by the corresponding sub-policy. And this sort of continues till the agent finally gets to the sofa and predicts the answer, which is great. So essentially, the job of the master policy is to predict these semantic sub-goals, right? Diving deeper into the architecture, both the master and the sub-policies are instantiated as recurrent neural networks. So here we're using a GRU. At every step, it's taking as input these first-person observations and trying to predict which sub-goal to execute. The action space consists of 64 predefined sub-goals. Some of these take as input certain parameters versus not. So for example, the exit room or the answer sub-goal does not take as input any parameters. The find room and find object sub-goals have certain parameters associated with it for finding specific rooms or for finding specific objects. The sub-policy is instantiated in a similar manner. The sub-policies are GRUs as well. And we have a sub-policy for every sub-goal. And the action space for each sub-policy is actually pretty small. There are 4 actions: forward, turn left, turn right, or stop. And whenever these sub-policies predict the stop action, we hand back control to the master policy. So what this enables, what this sort of a hierarchical breakdown enables us to do is that we can train each part over compressed time horizons, and that sort of makes the optimization much easier. And a lot of these predictions are somewhat interpretable. Like if the master policy is predicting that find the sofa or find the living room, we know what it's trying to achieve and where it fails. So it makes debugging a lot easier. Both the master and sub policies are pre-trained on shortest paths and then fine-tuned using A3C, which is a form of actor critic on a distance-based shape reward. So whether the agent is getting closer or farther from the target object, and a question answering terminal rewards, whether it got the final answer right or wrong. Moving on to the results, we evaluate results on a few standard metrics. So here I'm showing the change in distance to target. So higher is better. Basically, did the agent get closer to the target or not? And compared to some earlier baselines, our model does pretty well. In terms of actual question answering accuracy, again, our model does fairly well. And here's a qualitative example of what the behavior of this agent looks like. So for the question, what color is the dressing table? The agent starts at a random location in the environment. The master policy first predicts find the living room. That gets executed by the corresponding sub policy. The master policy then predicts find the bedroom, which is interesting because maybe it expects that dressing tables are found in bedrooms. And that gets executed by the corresponding sub policy. Then the master policy predicts find the dressing table. The agent turns and sort of glances at the dressing table. And finally, the master policy predicts that it should now answer the question, and the corresponding sub policy predicts the answer back. So that was our initial work on embodied question answering. More recently, what we've been sort of interested in is that embodied question answering is sort of just one task that's possible in a situated environment, right? There are a whole bunch of other tasks that we can think of agents that we can imagine agents doing, right? So we don't want to necessarily always train separate models for separate tasks. So the question that we were interested in is that, can we do embodied question answering purely through self-supervised predictive modeling? And I'm going to unpack each part of this motivating question here separately. So this work was in a slightly different environment. It has the same components, but it looks slightly different. This environment was based on Unity. It has 96x72 RGB first-person observation. The action space is similar. You can move forward, back, left, right. You can look up, down, left, right. And it's fairly configurable. So it has support for 50 object types, 10 colors and 3 sizes. And all of these objects and colors and sizes and the room dimensions can be programmatically configured. So we can arbitrarily make the environment harder or smaller. In this particular work, what we're going to be training agents for is an exploration task. So we're no longer training agents for embodied question answering. We're training agents to explore the environment well. So the reward structure that we have for the agent is that we'll give it a reward of +1 for visiting objects that it hasn't visited before, a reward of 0 for going to objects that it has visited before. So here, if you look closely, there's this brown object. I'm showing a top-down map here. So the brown object, when it visits it the second time, it gets a reward of 0. And the rewards refresh once all objects have been visited. So basically, the behavior that we are incentivizing is that the agent should explore the environment and circle through all objects. The architecture is fairly straightforward. We have an agent that takes as input RGB observations. So those are the X subscriptees that I'm showing here. The images get processed by a CNN. The processed features get fed as input to a policy RNN, and the policy RNN predicts which action to take. And this sort of continues. The reward that we train the policy RNN with is the exploration reward that I talked about in the previous slide. But in addition, what we're doing here is that we have this predictive loss that's branching off from the hidden state of the RNN. And without diving into too much detail into what this predictive loss is, we experiment with 2 varieties of this predictive loss. But what both of these predictive losses are doing is that, conditioned on the hidden state of the agent's RNN and the actions, we are forcing the agent to predict what future observations are going to look like. So we are basically saying that if the agent were to take an action forward, right, it should be able to predict what those observations look like, right? And if the agent really captures a good representation of the environment, that prediction process should be easy. So this is action condition forward prediction. It can be unrolled for multiple steps in the future, and it's all self-supervised. So basically the sequences of actions, the observations, all of that is coming from the exploration trajectories that we are training the agent for. So there's no additional supervision that's being used. So that was the self-supervised predictive modeling part. Let's look at where embodied question answering comes in, right? What we basically do is that we tack on another head to the hidden state of the RNN, and we have a stop gradient attached to that head. So basically, and I'll dive deeper into how we train the QA decoder, the question answering decoder, but we don't backpropagate gradients from that question answering decoder into the agent. So the question answering decoder is basically an LSTM that takes as input the hidden state of the RNN and the question and tries to predict the answer. So it's similar to the embodied question answering setup in that the task is the same question and some representation of the environment. You have to predict the answer, but it's different in the sense that we're not training the agent end to end for that task. We train the agent for exploration, and we feed just the hidden state into this separate QA decoder head and try to predict the answer. The questions look similar to embodied QA. In fact, they have a few more question types, so they're slightly more complex. So we have some attribute questions. What is the color of the, let's say, tennis racket? What we have a few like shape questions, like what shape is the red object? We have counting questions. We have existence questions. We have some comparison questions. So are there the same number of tennis rackets as mugs? And we have some spatial relational questions. So what is the color of the tennis racket that's next to the mug, let's say? Moving on to results. So the metrics that we're going to be looking at are is basically the top one question answering accuracy. The baselines that we're going to be looking at is a question only baseline. So given the question, can we predict the answer? So this baseline does not take as input any visual input, and the sole purpose of this baseline is to make sure that our environment does not have any biases. We have an LSTM baseline, so that does not have any auxiliary predictive loss. And like I said earlier, we experiment with two variants of the predictive loss. And then we have an oracle where we remove the stop gradient on the question answering decoder and train the entire agent end to end. So this oracle is actually the embodied question answering agent that I described in the previous work, right? And so if you look at question answering accuracy over the course of training for one particular question type, as you might imagine, the no stop gradient agent, which is the oracle, does the best. So that gets to more than 90% accuracy very quickly. The CPC, LSTM, and question only baselines are actually pretty close to random chance performance. And the SimCore agent actually does surprisingly well, which is interesting because what that essentially means is that the agent is able to remember what the environment looks like. And that information is stored in its hidden state and can be easily decoded into answers to these questions. Here's an example of what the agent's behavior looks like. So on the left, I'm showing the first-person view of the agent. Then I'm showing the top-down map. Note that the agent does not get as input the top-down map. It's only shown for illustration purposes. Then I'm showing the top predicted answers along with their probabilities. And on the right, I'm showing the answer probabilities as a function of time. So the radius of the red dots there indicate how peaky that probability is. And the vertical axis indexes over all answers. So for the question, what shape is the green object? The true answer here is bed. As you might imagine, the agent runs around in the environment, but as soon as it sees the bed at least once, it starts predicting the correct answer with a very high probability. And you can see how peaky that prediction is from the plot on the right, where it's basically just predicting these giant red dots for the correct answer. And that's interesting because it predicts the correct answer even if it's not looking at that object in its first-person view. So it's learning to store that, retain that information in the hidden state of its policy RNN. Here's another example. The question here is, what shape is the blue object? To which the correct answer is football. Again, the agent sort of runs around, circling from one object to the other. But again, as soon as it sees the football once, it stores that information in its hidden state and predicts the correct answer with a very high probability. If you look at question answering accuracy averaged over all question types, again, the no stop gradient oracle sort of performs the best, gets about 63%. The question only LSTM and CPC baselines are pretty close to 30% accuracy. And the SimCore baseline, the SimCore model does pretty well. It gets close to 60% accuracy. So it really shows that even if we don't train the agent end to end, SimCore does seem to be forcing the agent to learn a good representation of the environment. Going back to the architecture, one other thing that this architecture allows us to do easily is that we can just add on another head here to interpret what the agent is learning. So here, what we're going to try is that given the hidden state of the RNN, let's try and predict what the entire top-down map looks like. As you might imagine, we're predicting this in pixels. So this is a fairly hard task. And I have a couple of visualizations of what this looks like. So I'm showing the same example as before, with the difference that on the top right here, I'm showing a top-down map prediction from the agent. So the top row middle illustration shows what the true top-down map looks like, and the top row third illustration on the right is what the agent predicts. So the agent ran for a bit, came across the bed. I paused here because I wanted to show the answer probabilities. They were initially sort of uniform, but as soon as the agent sees the bed, it starts predicting that bed with a very high probability, and that sort of continues till the end of the episode. And the top-down prediction on the top right, you can see there that like even if it's not getting the pixel level accuracy, like even if it's not fine-grained, it is able to predict the colors and the locations of these objects with fairly high accuracy, even when it's not looking at the object, even if it's not looking at each of these objects, right? Here's the football example. So again, the agent runs around, it looks at the football, it starts predicting the correct answer with a high probability, and it continues to run around from one object to the other. And when it's spent enough time in the environment, it starts predicting the top-down map with a reasonable accuracy. So it's predicting the locations and colors of these objects quite well. So to summarize this part of the talk, we basically introduced question answering as a task agnostic method to probe an agent's internal states. We used it to evaluate two predictive losses. And what we found was that non-predictive agents, such as a vanilla LSTM, do not capture environment semantics. And in fact, even if we have these predictive losses, not all of them are equal. So for example, SimCore does a pretty good job of capturing these semantics in the agent's internal states compared to contrastive predictive coding. I'm going to jump to a slightly different topic, so questions at this point.
Abhishek,
yeah,
we have a few in the chat right now.
Okay.
I can rephrase them to you, or if you feel okay to read from the chat as well.
Yeah, just give me a sec. I'm trying to figure out how to get to the chat.
Oh.
Yeah, so the first question, among the 100 candidate answers, there could be cases where multiple of them are correct or sort of correct. Yeah, that's a good point, and that is indeed the case. That if we have a programmatic way of extracting these candidate answers, multiple of these can be correct. And so we went back and we fixed this. I didn't talk about it in the talk itself, but like we went back and we collected annotations from humans for all of these 100 candidate answers to mark whether they're correct or wrong. And so we now have fine-grained scores for each answer in the 100 candidate answers for the test set. And we use that to compute the NDCG metric. So the latest iterations of the challenge take into account the fact that multiple answers can be correct. The next question is, how would you challenge cis-normative face reference assets that identify genders based on cis-normative facial features? I don't think I don't think I understand what the term cis-normative means. So like if someone could help me out with that, I'm happy to. That and which part of the talk is this referring to? Like, is this referring to visual dialogue or?
I think, yeah, so it was, so the question came up during the visual dialogue example with the, is she holding an umbrella, that example, I think. But I'm
Right.
not sure if I understand the question though.
Hajar, if you're on chat and if you're willing to participate, it would be great if you could help out.
Hi, can I talk?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so yeah, it's exactly that example where it was somebody who was holding an umbrella, and I guess they have masculine features and the other person has feminine features. And I know Facebook uses specific facial feature assets that identify people by masculine or feminine features. But asking a robot basically asking a robot to identify the gender of a person, and then us who are cis people coding in our biases, like, oh, that person has masculine features, so we're going to refer to him as a he, or that person has feminine features, so we refer to them as she. And that's something we're going to teach to bots or robots. And that's the whole question, like, that I worry about. How would we address that? How would Facebook address that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I have a couple of initial thoughts on this. One, this work was done before I joined Facebook, and so like, yeah, I just want to detach that. Whatever I'm going to say does not represent Facebook's views on this. So the data set is publicly available, and these dialogues were collected from humans on mechanical turk. So essentially, you're right that the dialogues that we train these models using does have biases that need to be addressed and fixed. And these biases are also in the data set that we're training these models using. One way that I can think of is to go about potentially addressing some of these issues is to train models to sort of explicitly train models to not condition its answer predictions on some of these features that we understand and know the model should avoid, right? Like it's not necessarily the case that because the data set is biased that the model also has to be biased, right? If we know that gender, race, a lot of these are sensitive issues, then we can explicitly train the model to not condition its predictions on that. And there's some recent work looking at how to do that. Admittedly, I haven't explored that yet for visual dialogue, but that is definitely a drawback in these current set of models. So I wouldn't, for example, recommend using this in production yet. This is far from production level quality. Yeah, not a great answer, but that's all I have for now. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you, Abhishek. So I think for the sake of time, we can move on to the next question, right?
Yeah, so our answers are like can't tell, taking a prominent portion of all answers collected. Is there other cases of such universal answers? That's a great question. So can't tell is not a prominent part of the dataset, but essentially what the model learns is that it's an answer that can be applied to a whole bunch of questions. It's a correct answer in some sense to a whole bunch of questions. And so the model, that's sort of a failure mode that the model converges to. And there are several different paraphrasings of can't tell, like I cannot tell, or like I don't know the answer, or something of that sort, that can be universally applied. What would be ideal is if we can look at multiple predictions from the agent, and the agent predicts confidence values along with those answers to give a more holistic picture of what it thinks the answer to the question is, instead of just predicting can't tell. But yeah, that's definitely a failure mode. Going to the next question, how does a robot start the first question without knowing anything about the photo? We condition the questioning side QBot on the caption. So the answering side starts by predicting a caption of the image, and that was sort of, we had to do that. It's sort of a hack, but we had to do that because otherwise the questions it's just very hard to ask 10 questions to figure out what's in the image. So to work around that, we seed the conversation with a caption. The next question, for the agent's navigation, is it compelled to detected objects, or is its movement randomized and it discovers objects? We train the agent first with supervised learning on shortest path trajectories. So there, the shortest path trajectory always ends at the object that the question asks about. So in that sense, the agent is being forced to learn that it for a particular question that, let's say, asks about a sofa, it needs to navigate to the sofa. But in the reinforcement learning stage, it can arbitrarily bump around different objects in the environment until it finally gets to the correct object, and it gets a high reward as it gets closer to the correct object. So after the supervised learning stage, when we do reinforcement learning, it has to learn these object to question correspondences.
Thank you, Abhishek. Actually, I have another question. Well,
Yeah,
also
go for it.
adding on live kind of interaction to this talk rather than you are reading from the chat. So one of the thinking like topic you mentioned about is the sparse reward issue in the EQA as well as the visual dialogue. I think similar kind of concern. And with sparse reward typically leads to sparse evaluation. You essentially evaluate the agent at the very end of the task. Now it's a combination of NLP, vision, as well as navigation. I was wondering if you have any, or whether you guys are working along the lines of how to attribute models' performance back to which part is going wrong. Could be the cause of a failure case, or a similar kind of concern was mentioned in VQ as well, because you cannot attribute whether it's object recognition or attribute recognition or a holistic of all this together that leads to the wrong answer or leads to the correct answer, right? So do you have any insights to share or comments on the challenge here?
Yeah, so I have 3 thoughts on this. One is that there are methods like GradCam or CAM or gradient visualizations that we can always rely on. They don't always work, but they provide at least some signal. So essentially what these methods do is that for a particular prediction, we can project back the gradients into the input image to see which part of the image the agent looked at to predict a particular answer, right? Mm-hmm. And so those sort of techniques exist. We haven't yet tried it for embodied question answering, but yeah. So that's one. The second is that if we are trying to build agents for specific natural language based embodied tasks, like if we, for example, focus just on an agent that can answer all sorts of color questions about objects, let's say, then we can code in intermediate metrics, right? Like we can code in whether the agent is getting closer or farther from the object, and we can evaluate performance on all of those intermediate metrics. But if we want a general form of evaluation, where we want to build agents that can solve any natural language task, natural language task in an embodied setting, then I think my response to that is that like the only way to evaluate that thoroughly is to learn these evaluation metrics from human demonstrations. Like we need some way of scalably collecting data in these situated environments and then learning evaluation functions to attribute where in its trajectory the agent is going wrong. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. And actually, it's interesting that you mentioned color as an example here, because I actually got this same. I mean, I will also come up with a follow-up question since I got the same question before. One of the audience mentioned about even the color perception, right? So if we're focusing on color perception, it varies from person to person. It's not showing up in the simulated environment too much because the pixel values are essentially not going through a whole physical interactions with the lightning or that, right? And I'm also wondering, do you have any thoughts along this line, especially if you have, I do understand all the data is collecting from multiple human beings, but will be inevitably disagreement among them. And how would you deal with that?
Yeah, at the very least, I think we can, so if we change the modality of the answer prediction from like predicting color labels to, let's say, predicting RGB buckets, then that's going to be accurate, right? Like, and we can learn different mappings from those RGB buckets to different languages that we care about. So like, that might be one way to go about it, where we change the answer space from color labels to RGB buckets.
Excuse the background noise. Let me mute myself.
Okay, cool. How am I doing on time, by the way? Like, how much time do you think I have?
We are planned for an hour talk, but if you are okay with free time to share, we actually can go all the way to, let's say, 1:15, like, which means in California time, 5:15. We can go all the way to 5:15 if you are available.
Okay. Yeah, I figured this. Yeah, I figured I'm running slightly late on this.
I'm super curious about the Open Catalyst project. Actually, we have AI Institute planning efforts here at ASU, trying to use AI for material science. So I don't
Okay,
know
awesome.
from,
yeah.
from that project here today, but definitely I'm interested. Along.
Okay, yeah, good to hear that there's interest. I will try to keep it brief. Yeah, just for the sake of time. Right, so the Open Catalyst project is sort of this largest collaboration between FAIR and CMU. There have been a few other collaborators from NERSC and Stanford, but it's primarily a FAIR and CMU project. We started working on it almost a year and a half back, and we recently hit our first sort of major release. So what's the project about? The primary motivation is climate change. So here I'm showing a plot where on the vertical axis, I'm showing energy demand and generation as a function of time on the horizontal axis, right? So this is for a day in California. As you can see right now, demand is much higher than renewable energy generation. And even if we were to scale up wind and solar energy, the plot would look something like this. So the problem here is that during the day when the sun's shining, there's excess generation. And then during the night when the sun's not shining, there's excess demand that's unmet. So we essentially need some way of storing energy from times of excess generation to excess demand. And if we think of ways to store renewable energy, a couple of methods pop to mind, right? We can use batteries or we can pump water uphill. Batteries are great, but they're extremely expensive. So they cannot be scaled to global size grids. Pumping water uphill is extremely efficient, but of course it needs mountain valleys to flood. So it's not possible to do this everywhere in the world, right? One method that has the potential to scale to global size grids is that we use the excess electricity from times of peak generation to convert energy to storable forms. And then we can use up this stored energy to convert it back to electricity when we need. So here I'm showing a couple of examples, but there are actually lots of examples of these sort of chemical processes where we can use excess electricity to, let's say, split water into hydrogen and oxygen. We store the hydrogen, and then we can use up that hydrogen when we need in fuel cells, right? And hydrogen or methane are very easy to store. They don't run into the same issues as, let's say, lithium-ion batteries. And the main sort of bottleneck here is that we need to find catalysts that can drive these chemical reactions at high rates without being consumed in the process. The reason these sort of technologies don't exist yet is that we don't have catalysts that are cheap and that can drive these reactions at high rates, right? So let's look at what an interaction with a catalyst looks like. So in all of these chemical processes, there's basically a tiny adsorbate molecule. So that's the red and gray molecule that I'm showing. And there's a surface of the catalyst. So those are the large gray and blue atoms. And the adsorbate is sitting on the catalyst. In any chemical reaction, at the beginning of the reaction, these two molecules are in sort of a high energy state. They then move around. Basically, the reason they move around is because atoms are exerting forces on one another till the atoms eventually reach a relaxed low energy state. And based on this low energy state, based on the energy of this relaxed state, we can predict what the reaction rate is going to be, whether this reaction can occur in the real world or not, whether this is a good catalyst or not, right? And there are actually billions of such adsorbate catalyst combinations, and simulating these relaxations accurately with quantum modeling techniques takes 8 hours. So it's extremely slow. So the idea is quite simple. We want to approximate these simulations with machine learning. We want to reduce the time it takes to simulate each adsorbate catalyst reaction to close to a second, right? Concretely, the machine learning problem here is that you have 3D atomic positions and atomic numbers as input. You construct a graph where the atom is the node with edges connecting to neighbors. We model it with a graph neural network, and the graph neural network predicts atomic forces. We can now go back and use these forces to recompute the atomic positions. So basically, given the force and the position of a particular atom, we can predict where it's going to be after, let's say, 1 nanosecond. And we sort of continue this iteratively till the max force on each atom is close to 0. And if we can do this accurately, hopefully we have a machine learning model that can simulate the entire relaxation. So we recently released a large-scale data set to do these sort of this sort of modeling. This data set contains 1.3 million DFT relaxations for training and evaluation. So it's a really large data set. It's the largest data set for this task than any existing data set that I know of. In total, it has 130 million plus training examples, and the dataset is publicly available on opencatalystproject.org. And if we zoom out and look at sort of the high-level goals of this project, we created this dataset, and we are now laser focused on building better models. Once we have models that work good enough, we're going to run inference on billions of adsorbate catalyst combinations. We're going to verify those predictions using DFT. So DFT is the quantum modeling method that I talked about, which is slow, but we're going to use that for validation. And we'll repeat this till we have good enough models. Once we have good models, we're going to collaborate with chemistry labs that actually synthesize some of these catalysts and verify whether whatever predictions our models are making are correct or not. In parallel, along with all of this, we'll make sure to open source all of the tools that we develop so that we as a community can be making progress on this. And hopefully by the end of this, we find good catalysts and can build these sort of cells that makes the earth happier. So that's sort of the bird's eye view of where the project is headed, right? Our dataset papers code are publicly available. The focus areas right now are modeling, active learning, scaling, data augmentation, self-supervision, and experimental verification. If you're interested in contributing, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to walk you through it.
Thank you, Abhishek. It's a super exciting project. So I actually have a question, right? Do you guys trying to model, so doing simulation and optimization as computer scientists, we understand almost the cost is similar, right? So it's just the computational expensive, how much computational power you need. While getting into experimental validation, different catalysts may yield different costs by validating. So I'm wondering if you guys are modeling that aspect into the process, and at least the amount of bench work varies significantly as far as I understand. I'm not an expert in experimental chemistry, but that's what I know. So if we model that into the overall project, what would you think and how would you see the role in the overall process?
Yeah, experimental verification is extremely slow and computer intensive, like you said. So we were recently chatting with a few collaborators who might synthesize some of these catalysts with us, and the max throughput there seems to be in the order of tens of catalysts per year. And if in the model training stage, if we are sort of experimenting with billions of combinations, going from that to 10 candidates that we actually want to synthesize is a huge ask. Our models need to be working really well. Yeah, so we are aware of that, and we are sort of taking that into account. For now, we are laser focused on improving our models. Like, we want these models to be working quite well, but at some point, hopefully in the next year or so, we will start synthesizing some of that. And the eventual goal is sort of that, yes, as you rightly mentioned, that like in the model iteration stage, yes, a lot of this might be compute intensive because these are large data sets. We might be throwing large models at it, but hopefully all of this is for good science, and eventually we can come up with models that can offset a lot of the energy that we consume right now, right? That's the hope. Yeah, that's the goal.
Thank you. Let me. And Tijas, could you take over? I have background noise here.
Thanks, Abhishek. So the last part of your talk was very interesting because it shows us that you can use machine learning models to help discovery in science. And it, like I've seen, so actually one of the invited talks at AAAI from Regina Barzilay was about a very similar initiative in drug discovery. So thanks a lot for sharing this with us. I think there's a question about this from Pratyay. How hard is the task? Are there any metrics that you can share?
Yeah. So Pratyay, I'd encourage you to take a look at our paper, which is online. And we have several different metrics that evaluate performance. Yeah, one of the hardest metrics that we have is this metric called forces below threshold. Basically, we simulate this relaxation, and if at the end of the prediction, the average force on each atom is close to zero, what that means is that the atoms aren't moving anymore. So if we can accurately predict that, then that's success, right? And so that's essentially what that metric is measuring. On that metric, we are still less than 10%. If we were at 100%, we could use these models today for actual experimental verification. So we are still pretty far off, but yeah, this is early days into this project. We are looking at a lot of ways to improve performance. It is quite challenging. We haven't seen any evidence of a machine learning model that can predict a single model that can make these predictions accurately for a whole bunch of adsorbate or catalyst combinations. All prior works that exist are able. All prior success stories in this domain are able to show that they are able to make predictions on very constrained chunks of this data set. So let's say for a particular copper-based or platinum-based catalyst, and for a particular choice of adsorbate, these models work well. And honestly, that's fine, but that's not going to get us very far, right? Like if we want to synthesize new catalysts, then our model needs to be working well on all of these elements, not just one or two elements. Only then can we look at compositions of these, like 2 metal or 3 metal alloys of this to see which ones are good catalysts. Yeah, so it is a hard task. Performance on the metric that I think is representative of practical impact is still less than 10%. Yeah.
So I have a small follow-up question on this. So do you see these models making, so as I understand, your model predicts the graph structure for a molecule. So do you see that it predicts something that hasn't been studied before or is a completely new molecular structure? Like are those molecules synthesizable always?
So just a clarification, our model is actually predicting forces. We give it an input. So the way to think about it is that we explicitly enumerate we're going to explicitly enumerate all combinations of catalyst surfaces that we can think of. So let's say if there are 100 elements that are useful, we can think of single element catalyst, 2 element catalyst, 3 element catalyst. We're going to explicitly enumerate all of them. We're then going to feed as input those catalysts to our model, and then we're going to make the model predict forces for each atom. And then if we iteratively do this, if we iteratively predict forces on each atom, the way this would work is that we predict a force, we move the atoms based on that force, and then we predict forces again, we move the atoms again based on that force, and if we do it till the forces are zero, that would simulate a relaxation. And yeah, so we are explicitly enumerating all possible element combinations as input, not necessarily making the model predict the structure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. So if there are any other questions,
yeah, we can probably fit in one more question from the audience. You are free. I mean, feel free to unmute yourself if you have questions to our speaker for both part of the talk.
Yeah, Pratyay here again. So I was just curious that are you people evaluating the laws of scaling, like increasing the parameters, like GPT-3 is approaching towards language, something on similar to on this task?
Yeah. We are exploring model scaling. Right now, the largest models that we have sort of trained are still, like baby models. They're in the order of 10 to 50 million parameters. But we are exploring graph parallelism, model parallelism to scale up to like 3 to 4 billion parameter models. So far, based on what we've seen, and this is based on like going from 1 to 3 million parameter models to 50, performance has been sort of almost linearly or log linearly increasing. So that's a good sign. But yeah, we don't know the limits of that yet. Maybe a billion parameter model, like maybe by then performance would have saturated. So that's yet to be seen. We are working on that right now.
All right. Thank you so much for joining today's seminar, Abhishek. It's our pleasure to have you here. Fairly exciting and great talk.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, hopefully this was useful.
Hopefully we can see each other sometime in person in a conference later this year.
yeah, hopefully. Yeah,
by the way, how I was about to ask the question. I'm wondering if we still have a few minutes. Any advice our graduating PhD students switching roles from, research labs to industrial research labs? Any kind of advice will be good because many of the audiences are working on this domain and graduating fairly soon. Hopefully.
Sorry, I missed a part of your question. So advice on industry research labs?
Switching roles from doing research in, research labs to industrial research labs.
It's still early days for me, so I don't know if I have anything super insightful to say. I can walk you through how I at some point in my final year, in my pre-final year, I was sort of deciding between either a faculty position or an industry research role. And my main motivation there was that I don't particularly enjoy teaching. And so I wanted to stay away from it. And that's why I went for an industry research position. The nice thing about industry research labs is there's a lot of compute available. Like the scale of compute that I had access to during my PhD versus now, there's orders of magnitude difference, which is always nice to have. It is worth being mindful that smaller and more efficient models are of course worth investigating and worth researching. But yeah, sometimes scaling helps, and so it's also worth running those experiments. One other thing that I enjoy about, and this is specific to being at FAIR, is that I am able to split my time between sort of the embodied AI-ish projects that I worked on during my PhD and something like the Open Catalyst project, which is entirely different. But yeah, hopefully towards a much more important and urgent problem, right? So I enjoy that freedom.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. I think it's great encouragement to our students as well. Thank you for being here again.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, one last call to see if there's any people want to say anything. Otherwise, we'll see each other next time in a conference. And enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye. Bye. Thank you.
Right. Nice
Thank you.
Thanks, Abhishek.
Yeah, thank you.